to meet these objectives, they're going to have to take into consideration CO2 emissions.
Welcome to Net Zero Carbon, a show on Freightwaves where we focus on information, insights, and inspiration in sustainability and transportation. I'm Danny Gomez, your host, and today I'm joined by Martin Lew, founder of Commtrex. Martin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot for having me, Danny. Appreciate you inviting me, and thank you very much for Freightwaves for having me also.
Yeah, so this show is focused, like as we say, in sustainability, and we thought it was great to bring you on. We think that rail is a really big piece in achieving lower carbon emissions in transportation. And, you know, we've known each other for a while. We go back a few years. We met in Houston. Luckily, at a happy hour, we had some mutual contacts, and that was really the start of my entrance into the transportation world and the introduction, I think, of Commtrex and Freightwaves. You guys started a bit of a relationship after that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Danny. I appreciate the relationship we built over the past few years. In fact, the reason why I know of Freightwaves or have been able to work with Freightwaves is because of the introduction you made to Craig. And that was just when I was kind of getting Commtrex off the ground. So both Craig and I were kind of growing Freightwaves and Commtrex fairly similar paths. Obviously, I focused on rail and he was more focused on supply chain, but it's impressive to see what Freightwaves has been able to build over the past few years.
Yeah, and we're excited today to talk about what you have built. I think going back to learning about your background, I think is really interesting in hearing that you had an early start and how this all kind of came about. You had exposure to the coal markets and the environmental markets, and I think the coal markets obviously fed into the ideation for Commtrex, and now the environmental markets are going to be, I think, a big part of all of our future, and that knowledge surely will come in handy. Do you mind just going through your background a little bit and how you kind of came to the point of launching Commtrex and all the background that fed into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to Commtrex, I was actually a commodities originator and trader for Bear Stearns at JP Morgan. And how did I get there? Before that, I actually went to law school, and I had every intention to be a securities lawyer. As I got to the sort of end of my law school career, I really figured out that I was more passionate about business than I was about law. So I decided to apply to different banks and got a job working in Houston on the coal and emissions trading desk for Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns was starting up an energy trading platform. So when I started at Bear, I was effectively a middle market originator focused on two components of the environmental and coal markets. Number one was really sort of trading SO2 NOx and carbon and renewable energy credits. And that was SO2 NOx was a pretty mature program. Helped developed by the EPA to really sort of mitigate the pollution in the air from sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide. And then coal was the other critical component to our business, which was effectively buying and selling physical coal from mines, selling it to power generators across North America, and then also finding the best opportunities to sell the coal across the world, focusing particularly on Europe and Asia. So March of 2008, JP Morgan buys Bear Stearns. The financial markets sort of go into meltdown mode, but one of two of the businesses that JP Morgan really valued in Bear Stearns was the global commodities trading business. And we were part of that. And because of the fact that they valued that, they continued to put more resources into it. So our business continued to grow, and I ended up being with JP Morgan up until 2014.
Okay. Coal is obviously a big part of rail. How did that experience lead into you seeing an opportunity to launch a marketplace and a platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So coal, if you look at all the different commodities, your 20 major commodity groups that move on rail, coal traditionally has been the largest by volume product that moves on rail. So very, very significant to all the Class 1 railroads and to the overall footprint of rail. And because we were moving millions of tons of coal a year, there were a lot of inefficiencies that I was able to identify that I as a shipper was constantly dealing with. And there were a few major areas where I thought, sort of needed to be addressed, and in order for coal to kind of be more efficient as we move into the next sort of phase of fossil fuels and energy. Number one was transparency. As an originator, working with our trading desk, time was always of the essence. So whenever we're modeling deals, we needed to have all the inputs to be able to calculate either the delivered cost or the net back to see if it was in the money to move. And oftentimes it was very difficult to be able to figure out what capacity availability there was, whether we were looking at terminals and ports that we're moving coal through, whether we're looking at rail car capacity to be able to lease cars, looking at transloading available capacity. There were a lot of different components to the freight move, which by being able to access it in a much faster, more efficient way, it was critical to getting deals done. Number two was connectivity. Both trucking and ocean-going freight were fairly mature markets with respect to connectivity. Load boards have been around for quite a while, and ocean-going freight had several sort of platforms and mechanisms to be able to see where capacity was available. Rail didn't have that mechanism. So, from being somebody who, worked at one of the largest banks in the world, if I was having trouble finding or identifying resources or people to help me out with the particular deals I was working on, I only knew that other shippers that may not have had the same amount of resources that we had have got to be experiencing the same thing. So when, thinking about where I thought the puck was going for rail, I knew that there was a primary factor that was going to change the way people function within rail. And that was really the changing demographics of everyone on the rail side and also on the shipper side. By 2020, 50% of the population or the global workforce will be millennials, and by 2025, be 75%. So, millennials are digital natives, and by default, the first place they go to, both in their personal and business lives, is technology. So I knew sitting in 2014 that eventually, all the transactions and a lot of the front office activities that typically were done over the phone were going to move to an electronic platform. So I decided to leave the trading world and start what at the time I thought was going to be the largest sort of marketplace and platform for the supply and demand side of the Railroad Industry Connect.
So who are the main users of Commtrex today?
So when you look at the marketplace, you look at it. I look at it in two different respects. There's the supply and the demand side. The demand side we view as the shippers. So they're really sort of driving all the shipping and freight that's moving across North America. And then the supply side is everybody who services the shippers. So that's everyone from your class one railroads, your short line railroads, transloaders, lessors, and then all the service providers that help sort of manage the fleet, from rail car repair, rail car cleaning, track services. So the primary component to our business has always been driven around the shippers. When you build a marketplace, you typically have to focus in on either the supply or the demand side, initially when getting the business off the ground. And we knew the critical piece to the success of Commtrex was to be able to get shippers to be active in using our system. And today, the shippers are the largest demographic of our sort of users, and absolutely the most active demographic, because they drive all the activity and all the requests that happen in our system.
Very interesting. And, as you look at Commtrex and the evolution, so you've got this large shipper community that's you're engaging with, and you're pulling in the carriers, right? How has that evolved over time? And even in maybe looking into a crystal ball a little bit, how do you think that evolves here in the future?
Yeah, so when we were starting the business, I recall talking to a lot of shippers and different focus groups that we had, just to kind of better understand how to use the product. And I remember at the time, back in 2015, the industry has been functioning in the same manner for over a century. And a lot of the folks that I were talking to really didn't see that there was going to be a major shift happening in the way business was transacted. So the focus really sort of initially was getting the industry educated on why it was important to adopt a centralized repository or platform. And the two primary reasons which I was constantly sort of out there evangelizing was, number one, we have to prepare for this next shift in the demographics of our industry. You have a tremendous amount of baby boomers and of logistic professionals that were going to be retiring over the next 5 to 10 years. And if there wasn't an electronic repository or one centralized database where all the information and all the different sources were located, and there wasn't a smooth transfer of information between sort of the generation with 15, 20, 25 years experience to the next generation. I knew that potentially could be an issue for the industry. So just getting people to buy into the fact that, we as an industry had to get ahead of this and really sort of make this a much more digitized industry for not our generation, or definitely for the next generation. And the second component of that is really sort of staying up with the times, because every mode of transportation was becoming more and more advanced with technology. Not only leveraging front office and back office technology, but really leveraging data analytics. So a critical component to this was figuring out exactly what we needed to do as an industry to be able to drive more efficiencies and effectiveness to really make railroading a much more competitive mode of transportation relative to trucking and other modes of transportation.
So Martin, technology and adoption and change and having an industry that's willing to change is really important. How have you seen the industry react to sustainability?
Well, ever since I started the company in 2015, sustainability has always been an issue that I kind of kept my ears listening for because of my background with environmental markets. So I also knew that was going to be a trend that eventually was going to permeate through the railroad industry, because it was already pretty evident that the S&P 500 and your Fortune sort of 500 and 1,000 companies were already putting CSOs and sustainability efforts in place. And not until about a few years ago did I really see a lot of the senior executives across the railroad industry and then also across the commodity shippers starting to talk about it in their 10Ks and their Qs, and you start hearing much more about it at conferences. And that's when us here at Commtrex really started to think about what is it we can do, at the very least on the education side, because the other component to our business that's a significant component is educating the next generation of railroaders on different components of the industry. So we knew that ESG and sustainability was going to be an important component. So that's, as of the past, call it year and a half, it's become a much more important component to the conversations we're having with both the shippers and the railroad side of the business. So, now more than ever, are you seeing the idea or the topic of sustainability sort of, as a major topic when your railroad executives are on earnings calls or when they're at conferences and they're speaking about, what are the major changes or initiatives they're taking. And the two major catalysts that you're seeing right now are really the stakeholders and the shareholders really sort of asking for more transparency on what's being done. And number two, really the people who drive everything are going to be the shippers. If they want to mandate sustainability as an important component to their overall transportation or supply chain strategy, everybody within that supply chain has to not only listen, but they actually have to put some resources into it if they want to help manage the product for those shippers.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about what people are saying publicly, and even more recently, we saw someone who published a sustainability report, and the number one item that they listed in terms of reducing emissions was shifting over the road to intermodal. And I think the quote was that it was 2.5 times more or less carbon intensive to do that transportation over rail. And so we've continued to hear this, right? It's not just one specific person. It's a lot of people across the industry that are turning to rail as a way to reduce emissions. Even the EPA, I think it lists on their website as one of the key things that firms can do to reduce emissions. Obviously, you have to balance that between the service that you're wanting to provide for the various goods that you're shipping. But how have you seen, or what have you seen in the industry, in the rail industry? Has there been a pickup? I believe I would expect that transloading would be a great place to look to see that activity picking up.
Yes, right now in particular, over the past, since the pandemic and now that we're coming out of the pandemic, the supply chain congestion and choke points are more highlighted and magnified now more than people have seen in their careers. And our transit marketplace, which we launched about a year ago, really timing wise came about at the perfect time because in order to be able to create flexibility within your supply chain or within your transportation strategy, transloading is that mechanism or that piece that really can help you provide more optionality to how you move your product. So for those who don't know, transloading is moving freight from one mode of transportation to the other. So think about the lanes that a lot of these shippers move in. If they wanted to figure out different ways to be able to move, cross modality, transloading is really that mechanism that allows them to do that. So an important component of transloading, obviously, is either going to be carload transloading or intermodal transloading. And on the intermodal piece, you're absolutely right. When thinking about where you can probably capture the most, decarbonization or the most sort of reductions in GHG footprints, it's really trying to move as much freight moving by truck over to rail. And that's something that we're seeing a lot more, not only from shippers, but also from your large IMCs, your freight brokers, your large 3PLs. There's a major shift right now with folks that are making strong targets or objectives or goals to, either sort of, double or in some cases more than double the amount of sort of capacity they move from trucking over to rail. And the rails are doing a great job with helping to accommodate that because every single Class 1 railroad website, now they all have carbon calculators as well. So they're also trying to play their part to be able to give transparency and educate shippers on what the alternative is. So if they're currently moving truck between one origin destination and they're contemplating sort of moving that from truck over to intermodal or to rail, I think an important part of the decision-making process is what is that reduction in GHG emissions that can be captured through that. And 2-3 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that across all the railroad websites, and now that's front and center on every single Class 1 railroad website. And then also when you're going in and putting in a request for freight rates, that is a component of the freight rate that comes back to the shipper is not only what the rate is, but also what is that GHG emission savings. So, you see it not only from the rail sector, but you see it also from shippers that are also making a lot more effort to be able to figure out ways to move more product by intermodal versus truck.
That's super interesting. I mean, do you feel like there's enough capacity to serve a growing market?
Well, the thing with intermodal is versus trucking is you're not relying upon truck drivers.
Right.
So you are relying upon locomotives. And when you think about where you're going to gain the most efficiencies for the carbon footprint for rails, it's really going to be in fuel management, and that fuel management really is going to come from how they manage the locomotives and how they manage the locomotive capacity. So there's a huge step up in investments to moving to these Tier 4 locomotives that are much more fuel efficient. A lot of folks don't realize it, but a lot of times when you see a locomotive or a train that's at a standstill, locomotives, they're running. They don't turn the locomotives off, so they're idling. So, now there's more technologies that are being explored and researched that are going to be able to help turn those locomotives on and off to be able to save on fuel and then also to be able to save on emissions. But really where the most gains are going to be captured for the rails are going to be in the fuel management, so also in creating longer train sets. But to your point though, yes, I do think there is the capacity there for the rails to really step up and to manage all the capacity because they're not so reliant upon there being enough human beings to be able to drive the trucks. And the typical ratio you think of 4 trucks for every for every train load or for every car load. So there's a lot less of a footprint you need just generally physically when you're moving product by intermodal versus truck. But yes, the railroads they see that demand coming and they're doing everything they can to be able to have enough supply capacity to meet that demand that's growing.
That's interesting because we talk a lot with people about what can they do now, right? Because I think there's so much focus on longer term technologies. EV obviously takes a spotlight in most conversations, but that's not something that we can transition to overnight. Alternative fuels will be probably a transition to EVs, but that also has its own infrastructure challenges. And so, even last when we were talking to Dan Lewis, who from Convoy, about what they're focusing on, and they're focusing on the things that you can do now, which is reducing empty miles as one example. Having intermodal seems like another, not easy, maybe easy, but very, practical thing that people can do as firms look at their supply chain and try to identify the types of activity that they can move to rail. Is there an easy way for them to identify what types of activities? Is it certain distances, certain geographies? Is it certain types of products?
Yeah, typically when you're thinking about intermodal, there's the radius you're looking at for intermodal really makes sense. It's kind of that 700 to 750 mile radius. Once you get past that, you're kind of in that long haul, you're in the long haul category. And if you're a shipper and you're moving freight and you have certain lanes where you are doing more long haul trucking, those are probably the lanes that you're going to assess first. And, to just be quite frank, you're probably already assessing that just because of the fact that there's such a limited amount of capacity in a lot of the lanes already. So you're not only doing that for sustainability efforts, but you're practically doing that to be able to create more reliability with your supply chain. Now more than ever, through our transloading marketplace, we're seeing shippers who A, have never ever moved freight by rail, or B, have moved freight by rail minimally, but primarily have moved by truck. They're coming to us and they're asking us for help with assessing their strategy of how they're looking at their lanes and should they be looking at their lanes differently because of these constraints. So, not only do they have at the more senior management level these target goals for, what their GHG emissions are going to be by certain target dates. So that is a component of it. But I think even more practically is just, in order for reliability to really be there, they need to know that there's optionality, there's flexibility with how they move their freight. And at this time, because there are so many choke points up and down the supply chain, shippers are being forced to be able to reevaluate all their lanes of business. And because of that, you're seeing the railroads really trying to figure out how they can help these shippers provide more capacity through these lanes that potentially have never ever moved via intermodal. But that's really sort of driven by what's happening right now overall in the supply chain. So you take those two factors, you take the supply chain congestion and the choke points, and the fact that there's so much pent up demand that was caused from the pandemic, and you take sustainability, and it's almost kind of a perfect storm, for the railroads and intermodal to be able to capture more freight spend from trucking.
Yeah, it seems like that, right? And one other question I have in regards to the truckload side. I mean, there is some level of, from a time perspective, that you're going to lose by going to rail. Can you speak to that a little bit, the difference or the sacrifice that one would give up to get emissions reductions by moving something that is long haul trucking over to rail?
Yeah, it's just so generally you're not going to have the same level of precision when you're moving a product by intermodal because of the fact that having a truck that you can track in real time and being able to have that truckload be able to get to a destination and track exactly where that's at in real time. And thinking about the logistics of moving intermodal, right? So there's intermodal ramps and terminals. And so it's not like a truck where a truck can go from origin directly to destination. So, it goes from, first mile all the way to that last mile. There's the first mile, there's the middle mile, and then there's the last mile. So there is that additional day that's typically added to any intermodal move. So when thinking about any move that you're making, or the moves that are, or the freight that's being moved over first from trucking to intermodal, it's going to be your less time sensitive freight and products. And if you have product or freight that is less time sensitive, that it doesn't need to be there sort of within a very small sort of window time frame, it makes more sense to be able to move that. But as we build more, we as a railroad industry build more terminals, build more ramps. There are more micro distribution centers that are put along the footprint of the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. I think intermodal is going to start to shrink the amount of time that it has as far as the delay versus actual trucks in getting product to the final destination. But not every product is time sensitive. A lot of times that one day, that extra 1 or 2 days that it may be integrated because of the intermodal move. For a lot of products, that doesn't make that much of a difference. And if it doesn't make that much of a difference, I think that the fact that you have more reliability, more flexibility, and you're also getting some sustainability sort of gains through that, I feel like that outweighs the amount of time that you may lose on that intermodal move.
Makes tons of sense. So you've got the van market who can now utilize more, the people who are utilizing the van market who have the option or should be exploring options to be using rail, not only for capacity reasons, but also for emissions and emission reduction goals. What do you see inside? You talked a little bit about fuel management on the locomotive side, and also, there's the idea of making the locomotives even more efficient, right? Is just like on the road, is there focus on electrification of locomotives? What is the medium term, like alternative fuels will be in van, and then the longer term, like EV, will be in van in the locomotive space as well?
I think battery powered locomotives is probably next on the horizon. BNSF Railroad has been testing battery powered locomotives. In fact, they recently conducted a test that seemed to be very successful in California. And when you think about the way that electricity can be managed for locomotives, it's going to be much easier, I believe, from what we're seeing, at least from the initial sort of results, to be able to have battery electric powered sort of locomotives relative to hydrogen power or even sort of electric lines that you would see in a passenger train, just because there's a lot of interference operation that potentially could happen through that. With that said, I think technology is advancing very quickly, and the more alternatives there are to be able to create a cleaner way for locomotives to move, the better. But right now, from what we're seeing, it feels like there's a lot more support behind battery electric powered locomotives. Also on the locomotive side, anti-idling technologies, as I mentioned earlier, are very important. That's something that I think technology is going to address very soon. Distributed trains and being able to move larger trains and longer trains with more capacity is another way that the railroads are able to manage and create a much more fuel efficient sort of move. And then the other way that we're seeing some of the railroads sort of integrate right now are leveraging big data analytics. And taking the big data analytics and taking all the different moves and all the different sort of moves across the network and really sort of analyzing to see how can they optimize the horsepower per tonnage for every one of those moves. Are there different ways that the locomotives, on certain moves or lanes are moving, or how they're moving, or how they're managing can be reduced because of the fact that they know that, from point A to point B, the locomotive does not need to be running as much. You don't need to have as much power to get from, a particular sort of origin to destination. And then, optimizing the software around sort of the way the power is managed as well. So there's a few different levers that the railroads currently have and they're exploring. But when you think about how much investment is being put back into technology and into fuel efficiency, I think you're seeing more now than ever before. So the railroads are taking a very serious stance and position with making sure that this is an extremely environmentally friendly mode of transportation. I mean, it already has a very powerful, sustainable story as it is by being the most environmentally friendly mode of transportation, but when you think about, where we are today, I think you fast forward 10 years from now, what we see today, I think is going to be table stakes relative to where we're going to be 10 years from now with respect to efficiency and reducing our emissions footprint.
That is awesome. I think that's great. To hear, again, we focus on inspiration. I think that is inspiring to know that there's so much happening in the rail space, that there's opportunities now for emission savings, that it's only going to get better. And so, definitely to stay tuned. Martin, you've done an amazing job putting information out on your website. I encourage folks who are listening to this to go to your website. What is the best way for people to get connected and to learn more about what Commtrex is doing?
Yeah, go to commtrex.com, or you can, send me a note at my email, mlew@commtrex.com, or, follow us on LinkedIn. an important part of what we feel our role as an industry is trying to provide as much education and content and as much information on what's happening in the industry. And all of our content is really driven by our community of members. So if there's anything that you're looking to learn about within an industry, we're trying to provide that through our resources section. And overall, we feel like it's an important part of our role, as stewards of the environment to help make railroading successful to the mode of transportation.
Well, this has been informative, and hopefully this can be added to the library of content that you're providing. We just scratched the surface, and we're going to have you back, so I really want to dive in on carbon markets as well.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Danny. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.